Okay. So nutrition tips to improve body composition. Like I mentioned, we're going to focus on carbohydrates, calories, healthy fats, and sugar substitutes today. Going back to review why body composition is important, as you see here, a typical weight, a typical curve to the body composition is a C shape, which means that the muscle mass and the body fat are disproportionate from each other. This happens with aging, and it happens with cycling our weight. And we're trying to improve the body composition when losing weight by changing the shape to a D, meaning that we are losing body fat and we're preserving our muscle mass. So what helps access body fat stores? So in order to lose body fat, we have to pay attention to our caloric intake and to the carbohydrate intake. And what helps preserve our muscle mass is having a good amount of protein intake. And that's what we reviewed last week. So this week, we're going to focus on carbohydrates and just a little bit on calories, but not a whole lot of time on that. So the steps to improve body composition, like I mentioned last week, is to eat good quality food. We start with protein, and then today we're going to go over carbohydrates, fats, and we are going to discuss managing stress and exercise strength training in the future calls that we're going to have. But basically, our focus is to optimize all the components and all the interventions that help us improve our body composition, because that is what's going to make our weight loss sustainable and what's going to help us preserve not just muscle mass, but also muscle function. So reviewing calories, a calorie is not a calorie. It all has to do with how those calories are metabolized in our body and how much insulin is released for those calories. Insulin is the hormone that controls the fat metabolism, stores calories into fat, and blocks breakdown of fat. So as you know, we can't break down fat and store fat at the same time. A meal plan that lowers the amount of insulin secreted is beneficial for weight loss, and that's the focus of today, to see how we can limit carbohydrates. But before doing that, really knowing a little bit more about the types of carbohydrates and how they come into a healthy weight management plan. So as you all know, carbohydrates can be used by any cell in your body. You can find them in sugars, in grains, vegetables, legumes, fruit, nuts, and seeds. What is important for you to know is that they are not all the same, and they're not an essential nutrient, which means that we can definitely live without them. However, I don't think a drastic carb restriction is necessary unless there is severe insulin resistance. And when I mean severe insulin resistance, it would be like a type 2 diabetic that requires insulin administration, significant insulin administration, like, above 100 units per day. So most of us are not in that category. That means that we can make progress with moderate carbohydrate restriction. A carbohydrate is basically anything that has glucose, like for example in starch, fructose, which is the sugar in fruit, or galactose, the sugar in milk. Glucose consumption will make our pancreas release more insulin and make us gain weight, or prone to gaining weight and storing calories. Fructose consumption will drive the accumulation of liver fat, causing insulin resistance and leading to chronic metabolic disease. galactose, or the sugar in milk, gets converted into glucose. So consider it as a starch, just like the effects of glucose on metabolism. So the goal of weight management is to improve health and to limit refined carbs, because that would limit insulin release and insulin resistance, bringing insulin down, and in this way, allowing us to access body fat stores and breaking that down. Fiber is a very important part of carbohydrates, and it coats pretty much most starches when they are harvested, like wheat bran, brown rice, lentils, and beans. We usually refer to this as whole grains or legumes, the lentils and the beans. If you strip fiber, if you strip the fiber off, like wheat flour, white rice, and pasta, now we're talking about a refined carbohydrate, which drives insulin much higher than a whole grain. So let's review the starches. You all heard that whole grains are good for you. But what does whole grain mean? The FDA has no definition for whole grains. Most products that are labeled as whole grains are not really made out of whole grains. So for example, the first rule is that if a label does not say whole grains, it's most certainly is not a whole grain product. And then the second rule, look at the crust of the product. Like for example, the crust of the bread. If it is smooth, it's most likely pulverized whole grain, which is not as beneficial. If it is more granular, it is likely intact whole grains. And also, when we're talking about starches, there's also two different types of starches. There is the amylose that is found in beans and other brown or green legumes. This one has a lower GI index than amylopectin, which is in grains and in starchy vegetables like corn and potatoes. And because it has a lower GI index, it will affect the blood sugar slowly. So that is why things like legumes and beans, lentils, things like that have a slower impact on our blood sugar. Not to mention they are also bringing a protein component to our nutrition. So on the other hand, amylopectin, which is found in grains and in starchy veggies like potatoes and corn, because that it has a higher GI index, it will raise our blood sugar much faster, in turn affects our weight management and our capacity to break down body fat. So it is important to take into account the types of starches, because the amount of insulin made in our body in order to manage the calorie intake is in response to how those calories impact our blood sugar levels. So that is why a calorie is not a calorie. It does matter where they're coming from and the balance between different macronutrients like carbs, protein, and fat. So there are studies that show that a high glycemic index carbs drive intake by interfering with our reward system in the brain. So as a result, when our carb intake is high, we crave more of those foods because they make us feel better. That's the whole concept of the comfort food. We never crave carrots as a comfort food. It's typically something made out of a refined carb, sugar, and fat. So fiber is a nutrient that is very beneficial for the fullness feeling, for also to decrease the amount of absorption of blood glucose from the colon. There are two types of fiber. And I like to say, one of the things that is good for us to check if we're feeling hungry is, first, make sure we're eating enough protein. Second, making sure that the carbohydrates are in check. Third, making sure we're bringing enough fiber. And fourth, making sure we're drinking enough water. So these are things that are like the first four things on my checklist when we're talking about hunger control. And then the last one is actually making sure that we're not talking about emotional hunger, which is a very different situation and it has a very different management. So going back to the fiber, this is beneficial, not just for blood sugar control, but also for fullness and appetite control. So there is insoluble fiber, which is cellulose, basically the stringy stuff in celery. And then there's soluble fiber or pectin. This is what holds jelly together. So fiber has two roles. It makes first a gel barrier that will limit the rate of absorption of food and gives your liver a chance to metabolize it so it doesn't get overwhelmed. You need both types of fiber for this to happen. And then fiber increases the transit rate of food through the intestine. So then when food reaches the end of the intestine faster, the satiety hormone at the end of the intestine can tell our brain that we're full. So we don't end up overeating or going for second portions. The principle of, giving our body time for the brain to receive that signal is all based on this, because again, it takes time for food to get to the end of the intestine where the satiety hormones are stimulated, and fiber makes that transit a little bit faster. So dietary fiber includes inherent fiber, the fiber that naturally comes with the grain or with the legume or the vegetable or fruit. And then it can have added fiber, which is soluble cereal fiber added by the food company to boost the fiber content to make you think it is healthier. So the names for added fiber is inulin, maltodextrin, polydextrose. There's just a few. There are numerous names that manufacturers use for different types of sugars on an ingredient level. So you're not always going to see it as sucrose or glucose. So there's a very interesting book that Dr. Robert Lustig wrote, in which he describes all the possible names that sugar is labeled on different products. So it can be very confusing when trying to figure out what are the ingredients in a product. What makes sugar different than any other carbohydrate is the potential for addiction, as it affects our hedonic brain pathway or our reward pathway. It can also affect our serotonin level and our mood. Comfort foods are typically a combination of sugar and fat, both of which stimulates serotonin production, which is also called the happiness neurotransmitter. So when we eat a food that has sugar and fat, that helps us relax and feel better. That is why, again, we don't snack necessarily on celery sticks or, vegetables, and we crave things like chocolate and pizza and, I don't know, a juicy burger. So going to fat has more calories per gram when compared with carbohydrates and protein. However, fat does not have any impact on insulin production because fat is the only nutrient that has no impact on our blood sugar levels. Also, there are fats that are essential for us, meaning that our bodies cannot make them and we have to bring them in our food in order to avoid becoming deficient. There are many metabolic processes that rely on fat intake, such as immune responses, cell membrane structure, brain tissue, synthesis of bile acid, cholesterol, vitamin D, and steroid hormones. So we know that fat has been demonized for decades. The thought in the 70s was that since fat contains 9 calories per gram, while a carbohydrate and protein contains 4, the dietary fat must make us gain weight. As a result, we had cut out meat and milk consumption specifically to reduce saturated fat consumption, and it wasn't really necessary. At worst, fat is cardiovascular neutral. There is also a rare condition which everybody needs to be aware of, which is called familial hypercholesterolemia. So this is, again, it's rare, and patients with this disease, they do have to restrict their saturated fat intake. The rest of us don't need to worry about the fat as much. However, it is beneficial to focus on healthy fats, and I'm going to talk to you about that in a little bit. And it's definitely, beneficial to limit refined carbohydrates and sugar. So going back to how many classes of fat, right? So there's actually 7 different classes of fat. They each have different health benefits and detriments. Omega-3 fatty acids, everybody's familiar with that. It is found in wild fish and flaxseed oil. It is an anti-inflammatory fatty acid. It can lower serum triglycerides. It repairs cell membranes. Omega-3 fatty acids, like I mentioned, it is only found in wild fish and flaxseed oil. And the reason for the farmed fish not having omega-3 is because farm fish is fed corn. So the omega-3 is actually in the algae that the wild fish are eating. So that's why if you eat a farm piece of fish, you pretty much get the same benefits as eating a steak. So you're not really getting the omega-3 fatty acids. So always try to eat wild fish. And as far as the next category of fat are monounsaturated or omega-9 fatty acids. This is found in olive oil, avocado oil. They're healthy fats, found in the Mediterranean diet, which has been consistently proven to be heart healthy. And they stimulate liver metabolism and can reduce arterial plaque formation. And then we have polyunsaturated fats, which is a grab bag group, which includes vegetable oils. They could be anti-inflammatory or pro-inflammatory. High amounts can cause immune dysfunction. So again, think of these, like the vegetable oils, as really processed fats, right? So we're trying to avoid them as much as possible. So saturated fatty acids, these are the fats that are solid at room temperature. So think of, red meat. Think of even chicken has saturated fat in it. Things like grass-fed animals, animal meat. Remember, they're fed corn, right? So saturated fat is also found in milk and dairy products. However, there is less effect of the dairy fat than the red meat fat because of the heme molecule, which adds additional health risk. So saturated fat can cause heart disease in that specific category of patients that have familial hypercholesterolemia. And that is something that can definitely be screened for. And basically what that means is a simple diagnosis tool is anybody that has an LDL above 190, right? I'm not talking about the total, the LDL above 190, 190. That means that it's most likely familial, which is a condition that it is rare and it does require more significant restriction of saturated fat. So if we're not in that category, we can bring, a moderate amount of fat and not have to worry about the effect that it has on our LDL. So moving on to MCT, or medium chain triglycerides. These are found in palm oil, coconut oil, and they can be used as an energy source. However, there is some suggestion and some association with heart disease. Remember, these, like coconut oil, has also a significant saturated fat component to it. And then last, there's the omega-3 fatty acids. These are inflammatory fats, and they're found in farm-raised animals and fish, fed corn and soy. Plant oils like canola oil, and these are associated with heart disease, insulin resistance, immune dysfunction. They're also pro-inflammatory. However, the worst category of fat is definitely, with no doubt, trans fats. These are partially hydrogenated oils. They're synthetic and they're found in processed foods only. They can definitely cause heart disease and non-alcoholic fatty liver. So the trans fats, this is the category that we have to sweat. And the good news is that trans fats have been restricted by the FDA. So it's definitely the one fat that is, restricted and really monitored closely. However, what I want you to know about the trans fats is the reason they're so dangerous is because they are synthetic and our body bacteria cannot digest it. So that means that we can metabolize fat and they end up lining our arteries and cause in our livers, right? So fatty liver disease, heart disease. So the way to recognize this hydrogenated fat, believe it or not, even if it says trans fat free, right? I'm gonna kind of teach you a way to look at ingredients to kind of know what type of food can have trans fat component in it. So for example, if it says partially hydrogenated on ingredient list in the list of in the nutrition table, don't buy it. It can be that it has 0.49 grams of trans fat per serving or less, and the food company is allowed to label the food as trans fat free if that amount is less than 1 gram per serving. So if you eat 4 servings of that food, you can quickly get to 2 grams of trans fat, which can do serious damage over the long term. So be on the lookout in the ingredient list on partially hydrogenated. That is basically an indicator that the food can has trans fats. So cholesterol, it's also a topic of significant debate. It's another essential nutrient if it's necessary for making membranes and the steroid hormones in our body. We actually cannot survive without cholesterol. So just like glucose, if we don't eat any cholesterol, our bodies will make it. So 1 in 500 people, so basically 0.2% of population, has a genetic lipid disorder that needs to reduce cholesterol and saturated fat intake. These patients also need to be on statin medication and cholesterol binders. And if you are not in that category, cholesterol is not going to be harmful. So we were told in the 1970s that cholesterol is bad for you. It can cause heart disease. And for years, we were told to refrain from eating eggs. We now know that eggs are among one of the healthiest and complete protein sources that we can eat. And I would say, if you enjoy eggs, you can have them every day, just like anything else, have them in moderation. But unless your cholesterol, you're in that 0.2% of the population. And we know that by monitoring the cholesterol levels. And that's why whenever we start anybody on a meal plan, we want to know their cholesterol before making dietary intervention. And then we're checking in 2 to 3 months. and we see how the cholesterol reacts to the dietary changes. So like I mentioned before, sugar has a lot of names. And Dr. Robert Lustig is a professor of pediatric endocrinology at the University of California in San Francisco. He has done extensive research on sugar and wrote the book Sugar Has 56 Names. And this is a complete list. Now, I'm not going to read this to you, but I want you to know that they all impact your blood glucose levels as they have a high glycemic index. So just know that there are different names, and this we're going to review. We're going to break things down a little bit onto talking more about sugar substitutes and also different types of sugars. So starting with natural sugar substitutes. So before moving further on this topic, why is it important to have a sugar substitute to begin with? So if we agree that blood sugar control is important in order to control insulin level and to help us manage our weight and inflammation, then we can just restrict sugar from our meal plan, or we can find low-carb alternatives, which are basically alternatives to foods that are high in sugar and starch that will be actually healthier for us and will give us that compromised food, that treat that we can have without having significant impact on our blood sugar and our weight management. So we always recommend a natural sugar substitute. So what is that? So things like stevia, things like monk fruit, these are natural sugar substitutes, and they have 0 caloric index, 0 GI index. The GI index is a tool that measures how different foods affect the blood glucose levels in our bodies within a few hours of eating. So foods can be classified in low, medium, and high glycemic foods ranked on a scale from 0 to 100. The lower the GI index of a specific food, the less it will affect the blood sugar levels. So just to give you an idea, sugar's GI index is 65 and glucose is 100. Remember, sugar is glucose and fructose. So these sugar alcohols here and the sugar substitutes, you can see that most of them have a 0 glycemic index, means they don't affect your blood sugar at all. That means they don't get absorbed and they will not cause an insulin increase metabolically. And going through this list, stevia, what's characteristic about it is that it does have a bitter aftertaste. So people like me that have a very sensitive bitter taste, right? I can taste the bitterness in stevia, I can taste the bitterness in my coffee. They will have a hard time using this because they can taste the bitterness in it. There are other people that don't have that taste as developed, and typically I look at those fortunate people as the people that like to eat kale, right? So just think of kale. It's, for me, it's very bitter and I don't particularly like it, and I really believe it's because I have this bitter taste that's very, very sensitive. Monk fruit, on the other hand, tastes totally different. It does have it has no bitterness to it. But it tastes different, and all the sugar substitutes, whether they're natural or artificial, they all taste different. So our job is to find and try different ones and find the one that we enjoy the most, and it does the trick to substitute and give us that sweetness in low carb alternatives or in our coffee, in our yogurt that we sometimes crave. Erythritol is a sugar alcohol. So now sugar alcohol is its own class, which are basically natural sugar substitutes. They're derived from vegetables and fruit, and they taste sweet. However, they don't get absorbed in our colon. So because of that, the GI index is low, However, using too much of it, it can cause diarrhea and bloating, because remember, they all kind of go through you. They don't get absorbed. So erythritol is one of them. And then the other one you'll see at the bottom is xylitol and sorbitol. And you see now the GI index starts going up, but I want you to know that anything below 10, it's a good GI index. There is Truvia, which is a combination of stevia and erythritol. And this is something that I really like when I go to get a coffee or something like that, because it's a combination of stevia and erythritol. It doesn't taste as bitter as stevia. So it's a good alternative to just the plain stevia packets. Allulose, it's also natural, and you're going to see this in protein bars. Inulin, it's a fiber, which again, fiber doesn't get absorbed, so it tastes sweet. However, it does have an increased amount of calories. And then we have the Yacon syrup that, again, it's inulin based, so fiber, and we have to be careful because of the calories. And so moving on to different types of sugars, like I was mentioning, they had different names, and these are some of the names that you might see on that list of 56 names. So sucralose, it's basically table sugar, right? And it is processed. It has 65 glycemic index. I want to tell you a little bit about maltitol. So you see on top of this is maltitol, which is a sugar alcohol. However, it's a high glycemic index sugar alcohol. So you see, like the the glycemic index is 26, which is significantly more than the previous page. So even though it is a sugar alcohol, some of it does get absorbed, and we typically recommend either avoiding it or calculating that net carb formula a little bit different by subtracting a half of the amount. And you all have this in that initial binder. So moving on to agave. So agave, it is natural. You see the GI index is 15, so significantly less than sugar. So again, they're not all the same, but they're definitely, you see their glycemic index is over 10. Coconut, palm sugar, apple juice, the orange juice. So get the sugar in fruit juices. It's very easy to get absorbed, and it will drive our blood sugar quickly. Honey, you see not a big difference between honey and sugar. And raw honey actually has a little bit lower glycemic index, and maple syrup, it's pretty close to sugar, right? So they're all natural. However, they will affect your blood sugars. And then moving on to artificial sugar substitutes, these are things like sucralose in Splenda, that is the yellow packet, aspartame in Equal, or NutraSweet, that's the blue packet, saccharin in Sweet and Low, and you might have seen this in the pink sweeteners, and Sunnet or Sweet One. I'm not even going to try to pronounce this one. All of these are artificial sugar substitutes. They are significantly sweeter than sugar, and they can cause increased carb cravings and inflammation. So I would recommend avoiding this as much as possible. It's not always feasible. For example, it's nice to be able to have a diet soda every so often. So even that, it will have some sucralose, but in my opinion, that will be still a better choice than a regular soda, as long as we moderate it and as long as it doesn't increase our carb cravings. So going over the effects of macronutrients on our appetite, sugar and refined carbohydrates stimulates our appetite. It can also have addictive properties for some. Sugar and fat both affect serotonin, which is the happiness neurotransmitter, and it makes us feel more relaxed. This is why comfort food are a combination of fat and sugar. Fiber stimulates GI index and satiety. Protein stimulates satiety. And alcohol stimulates appetite, but it also impacts our behaviors around food. So we are less likely to choose a healthier option available once we start experiencing the effects of alcohol. So I'm going to leave you with a few tips for a better shopping experience. Don't shop hungry, avoid or stressed for that matter. Avoid processed foods. Shop along the edges of the market, not along the aisles. Avoid foods that have partially hydrogenated in the ingredient list. And make sure sugar is not among the first 3 ingredients on the label. So in conclusion, sugar has many names. They all affect blood glucose, favor natural sugar substitutes and healthy fats. I can't, focus too much on how important our mindset is, especially when it has to do with carbohydrates. I see a lot of people going through what I call a mourning transition, in which they mourn the fact that, the carbs are restricted. So trying to look at, eating a certain meal plan as our choice, it is very helpful as compared to thinking of foods that we can or cannot have. So like I mentioned last week, we can have any foods at any time. However, we choose to eat certain foods because they make us feel a different way and they help us achieve our goals. Now that goal can be weight loss for some, for others is better health or better quality of life. For others, improving mood and stress management. So it all varies, but different foods make us feel a different way. And like I mentioned, it also stimulates or decreases our appetite. So the mindset is basically the secret in changing from looking at diets as a fix for weight management and looking more towards lifestyle approaches and a long-term